Good? All right, good morning. Welcome. Thanks for coming out this morning. I know it's a holiday weekend, so I'm actually just surprised to see this many people here. All right, so we are continuing our series, The Almighty God or the Almighty Dot. This week's lesson is titled Good Grief. And I have at the top Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. Romans chapter 2, verse 14 and 15, which say, "For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law are law unto themselves, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts, the meanwhile accusing or excusing one another." Introduction. So for the past few weeks, we've been looking at arguments for the existence of God. These have been mostly dealing with the physical sciences and philosophy. Today we'll be looking at a slightly different argument, morality and moral law. So the past few weeks, we've been looking at the cosmological and teleological arguments. And the reason I've done it this way, where we went through the cosmological, the teleological, and now the moral argument, is because those three branches are the ones that Scripture actually talks about. I mean, obviously you don't see the word cosmological or teleological appear in your Bible, but it talks about how we can look at God's creation, we can look at the created things, and we can see the fingerprints of the Maker, so to speak. Now with the moral argument, again, you see here in Scripture, the Bible claiming that God has done something in His creation that has left a witness. And this is that He has written His law on His creature's heart, and now that bears witness to Him as well. So the moral law is the idea that there exist certain actions that are impermissible across every culture and all time. This was brought to center stage after World War II, when the high courts were attempting to try many German officers and soldiers who committed atrocities in camps and on the field. When trying them, the Germans claimed that they broke no German law and they were following orders, so they must be acquitted. This was a good point, so the courts had to think about it before finally charging them with a newly made crimes against humanity charge. The courts told them, in a sense, that their crimes were so heinous that they transcended any man-made governmental system. They were admitting that there was a higher court that all men must answer to regardless of man-made rules. So World War II happens, obviously we all have seen the documentaries about the different camps and the stuff that went on there, terrible, terrible things. But basically when they went to try these men after the war was over, and these men said, "We're Germans, we're not Americans, we're not European, or we're not English, we're not French, we're not Greek, we're not any of these other countries, we're Germans. Our German law says we were perfectly fine in doing what we did. So you can't tell us what we're allowed to do and not allowed to do. We broke no laws. How can you try us by American laws? You can't try us by American laws. We're not Americans." So the courts had to go, okay, what they did was wrong, but yeah, how do we put them in jail justly when they didn't break any German laws? So they had to come up with this new thing of the crimes against humanity. And what they did is, as the whole court, as the whole European Union and the Americans and everybody else, what they actually ended up admitting was, we all agree that there is a law that transcends any of our governments. There is this moral law that is all across the world, no matter what country of origin you're from, it trumps your laws. And your crimes are so bad that we have to appeal to this higher court than even us. So, source of morality, the holy God. As Christians, we know that God is the source of all things moral and good. By virtue of His divine holiness, love, and justice, He wills our conformation to Himself. His will is for us to be as He is, holy, loving, and just. As Leviticus 11:45 shows that God called His people Israel to be holy as He is. So Romans 12:1-2, God tells us to present ourselves holy unto Him. God's attitude is that His creation should model His holiness. So let's go to Leviticus. Go to Leviticus chapter 11. So obviously the context here in Leviticus is the giving of the law to Israel and God calling out his people to be a peculiar nation amongst the nations of the world. So starting in verse 44, Leviticus chapter 11 verse 44, "For I am the Lord your God. Ye shall therefore sanctify yourselves, and ye shall be holy." And notice the reason he gives for this. "For I am holy. Neither shall ye defile yourselves with any manner of creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. For I am the Lord that bringeth you out of the land of Egypt, to be your God. Ye shall therefore be holy again, for I am holy. And this is the law of the beasts and of the fowl and every living creature that moveth in the waters and every creature that creepeth upon the earth, to make a difference between the unclean and the clean, and between the beasts that may be eaten and the beasts which may not be eaten." So let's flip over to chapter 19, Leviticus chapter 19, and I would just want to highlight a few verses as we go through here. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 2. "Speak unto all the generations of the children of Israel, and saying to them, Ye shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." Drop down to verse 35. Well, actually, let's go 16. Nope, I don't want that one. But if you go down through here, if you see 16, end of 16, "I am the Lord." Verse 18, "I am the Lord." Verse 25, "I am the Lord your God." Verse 28, "I am the Lord." Verse 29, "I am the Lord." Verse 31, "I am the Lord your God." Verse 32, "I am the Lord." Verse 34, "I am the Lord your God." Verse 35, we'll read that one. It says, "Ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, in matriard, in weight, and in measure. Just balances, just weight, a just ephah, and a just hin shall ye have. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe all my statutes and all my judgments, and do them. I am the Lord." So God calls Israel out of the nations of the world. He says, "You're now my people," and he says, "You need to act in a certain way." And what reason does he repeatedly give them? I am God. You know, we all had that, right, when we were kids and our dad told us to do something, and when we asked why, what was the answer? Because I said so. So this is the "because I said so" of the scriptures. God doesn't need to give us any reasons why we ought to be something or do something like that. He is God. That's why we ought to do it. So flip over to Deuteronomy quick. So we had God is holy. God is holy, and he demands his people to do so as well. Go over to Deuteronomy chapter 32. Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 4. "For he is the rock, his work is perfect. For all his ways are judgment. A God of truth and without iniquity, just and right is he." So we have here God's justice. He is just, he is true, he has righteous judgment, he is without any iniquity. And this is the kind of attributes God has that he demands of us. This is why he demands of Israel back there, "Be like I am." This is who I am. You know, everybody gets all hung up on the rules of the Bible, right? Don't do this, don't do this. And they think, oh, God just arbitrarily decided, well, I don't like that, so don't do that. No, the reason why we have the commandments in the Bible is because that is who God is. You know, and because of who he is, that's where we ought to be, or where we ought to strive to be. So Zephaniah chapter 3. Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 5 says, "The just Lord is in the midst thereof. He will not do iniquity. Every morning doth he bring his judgment to light. He faileth not, but the unjust knoweth no shame." So again, God is just, and we talk about God's justice, and the reason I bring up some of these is because the next couple weeks we'll be looking at the necessary offshoot of the moral argument, which is the problem of evil. If we know good and evil, then obviously we can see that there are bad things that happen, and that shows us there's something wrong. There's something wrong with this world. And a lot of people want to point at God and say, well, God is love, God is love, no evil should exist. Well, yes, but God is also just, and He allows us to do things, and His justice demands that certain punishments be put in place. So let's flip over to Romans chapter 12. We'll go into the New Testament and see if this kind of idea is brought over into the New Testament, into the dispensation of grace. If God all of a sudden abandons this idea of whether or not His people that He calls out ought to be as He is. So Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Romans 12, 1 and 2 says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So what is the will of God here? What is the will of God in this verse, in this passage? Right, that we present our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. That's our reasonable service on the grounds of what God has done for us and what Christ has done for us. It is reasonable. It is totally acceptable for God to demand that we come to Him as holy as we can. I mean, obviously in our own power we cannot do anything good. It's Christ in us. But, as we as Christians, we as saints ought to be striving to be holy and to present ourselves as holy. So, God made man in His image. Back on the notes. God made man in His image, and He gave him His law on his heart. It therefore is safe to say that we can get this innate sense of morality directly from God. Since God, the Creator, is the true source of morality, it is no surprise that all people have a sense of right and wrong, of things permissible and things taboo. As Romans 2:14 through 15 teaches, all men have a law written on their hearts and a conscience bearing witness to that law. 1 Corinthians 5:1, if you want to turn there. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1. Obviously, we're in Corinthians, and as Pastor Study has been going through Corinthians now for a while, we know that the Corinthian church had quite a bit of issues, and this is one of the big ones. 5 verse 1 says, It is reported commonly that there is fornication among you, and such fornication as is not so much as named among the Gentiles, that one should have his father's wife. Paul says there is fornication in the church that even the Gentiles will not commit. The Gentiles understood that this practice was unacceptable. Only the Corinthians, who knew better, abused grace to do it. But the Gentiles and the Corinthians still knew the action was wrong. So the issue wasn't, the Corinthians knew this was a bad thing, right? They were fully aware that this was a practice that was not an acceptable practice. But why did they do it? If we remember from Corinthians, why did they do this? Why did they think they could get away with it? Right, they were under grace. They knew that where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. So they knew every time I sin, there's just more grace to cover it. Therefore, I can do whatever I want, and I'll just be covered by more grace. And they thought that was somehow made them more spiritual the more they sinned. So, but the point is, they knew this was wrong. All the Gentiles in the area, the unsaved, the unchurched, they knew what was going on there was wrong, because Paul calls them out and says, look, even the sinners around you, even these heathens around you, they don't do this stuff. They're not participating in this sort of action. This is not acceptable. So, back to the notes. The idea that this law permeates all culture is encapsulated in the Declaration of Independence. Quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Clearly, the Founding Fathers believed that there are certain rights and just actions handed down and seated in the Creator. The truths are self-evident because they believe all men know them without needing proof. So the idea behind the moral argument is that everyone has this sense. Everyone knows that there are certain things you should not do. There are some things you may do, and then there are things I ought not ever do. So C.S. Lewis wrote that no culture is immune to the sense of right and wrong. He writes, quote, "Think of a country where people were admired for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who had ever been kindest to him. You might just as well try to imagine a country where 2 and 2 make 5. Lewis here asks us to imagine these things because no culture has been like this. J. Budzwinski, professor at University of Texas, says something similar. Quote, "Everyone knows certain principles. There is no land where murder is virtue and gratitude is vice." Budzwinski, like Lewis, recognizes that all people and countries have certain codes of ethics. So everybody understand that? Anybody not get that point? Any questions before we move on to the argument itself?
Even people who want to try to deny this give themselves away when they have their own sensibilities offended.
True. Yes, and we'll deal with that. How do we see that? How do we know that people actually believe this even when they say they don't? Because you will find a few people who will say, morality, ethics, that sort of thing, it's just my personal preferences and stuff like that. Well, if that's true, then there's no reason to get upset about anything. That's just their deal. Almost, especially in our culture today, you can see the riots, you can see these, not riots, peaceful protests that are going on about all kinds of social injustices. And is it wrong for them to want justice? No. Is it wrong for them to want social justice? No. But if there's no such thing as morality seated in God, then there is no social justice. There's no such thing as justice in the first place. It's just something we made up. Don't get so angry all the time. All right, so the moral argument. All right, the moral argument, simply stated, is as follows. 1, all laws require a lawgiver. 2, there exists an all-encompassing moral law that transcends all cultures and governments. 3, therefore, there must exist a transcendent, all-encompassing moral lawgiver. So major contributors include C.S. Lewis, William Sorley. William Sorley was a professor of moral philosophy at Cambridge University. He wrote The Moral Values and the Idea of God in 1918 in his book. Sorley argued that God was our only hope to show a rational view of reality based on nature and moral orders. So William Lane Craig talks about him a little bit, and he reverses the argument to say, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. So that's the formal argument. Does anybody have any questions on that? Do they understand how that works?
So did Sorley come up with it, Lewis expand it?
Both of them write quite a bit on it. Craig kind of expands on Sorley's a little bit. He reads and uses Sorley's, and then he reverses Sorley's argument. But yeah, if you want extra reading on that, I would highly recommend. Obviously, C.S. Lewis has written quite a bit on it. Sorley has as well. All right, so top of page 3. So this may be more clearly stated. This may be a more clearly stated way of saying it. If naturalism is correct, then morality is an illusion and does not exist. Yet we know that morals do exist. So naturalism must be false. So C.S. Lewis. Lewis taught that, quote, feeling a desire to act in a certain way, say the desire to help, is different from the feeling that we ought to help, even if we really don't want to do so. In the case of a cry for help, we will normally feel two desires: the herd instinct to help, and the instinct of self-preservation, to keep out of danger. We also find inside a feeling that tells us we ought to follow the help instinct. Clearly, the thing which judges between the two instincts is neither of them. So, basically you have fight or flight, right? I don't know if I spelled that right, but... All right, so you have fight or flight instincts, right? Everybody's heard of either the fight or flight instinct. So what C.S. Lewis is saying is when I hear somebody call for help, instinctively I feel both of these. I feel both the desire to go help the person in need, and I feel a desire that I should get out of here or I'm going to need help. He says now, if I feel both of these and say, I rationalize and say, if I fight, there's a very good chance that I will die. If I run, I will survive. Maybe there's a slight chance of even rescuing that person. We both end up dying. Now, why do I still feel that I ought to do this instead of this? That's what he's saying in this quote is, we still have that desire and we decide to choose between the two. Why do people still choose this even though it means their own demise? And they know it. What chooses between the two? And he says there's a third thing, and that's the moral law, which judges what's right. What should I do? What is the right thing to do in this situation? Help somebody in need or run away and just ignore it. So here Lewis distinguishes between the fight or flight mentality, but another desire helps us determine which one to follow. According to natural selection, we should always choose our own survival. We would never choose to place ourselves in harm's way for another human. Yet as the Bible tells us, this is the true essence of love, as defined by scriptures that, quote, greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. John 15:13. So, we know that love is a choice, right? We cannot actually love without the choice to do so. You know, I give the illustration a lot of times with kids. If I walk up to Sylvia and I hold a gun to her head and I say, marry me or die. If she wants to continue living, her options are very few, right? So when I courted my wife, when we dated, I didn't do that. I didn't hold a gun. I didn't hold a gun to my wife's head and said, marry me or I'll shoot you in the face and you're going to die. You know, if she wanted to live, obviously we got married, right? But is that love? No, it's coercion. She has to marry me or she's going to die. She loves her own life. If she wants to preserve it, she will marry me even if she doesn't love me. So, love is a moral law that requires action. It is a demonstrative love that the scriptures command of the believers. So go to Romans 13. Romans chapter 13. So talking about demonstrative love being something we do, it's an action. It's a choice and it has action behind it. 13 verses 8 through 10 says, "O man, owe no man anything, but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. For this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. If there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the law." So, how do we fulfill the law? We fulfill it in love. How do we love? We demonstrate it, right? In the things we do, the way we act, what we choose to do to our neighbor is how we show love, and is how we actually love. So in Romans 13, 8 through 10, it teaches us that to love is to fulfill the law. We are to love others, love God. The world knows love is a good thing, although an often misled and wrong idea of what it is. They still know love is something to be sought and given. So obviously, if you read just about any author, watch just about any movie, underlined somewhere in that movie or book or something is this idea of love, right? It's like one of the greatest concepts in the secular world or Christian world. This idea of love is something that everyone knows is a good thing. Everyone is desired to be loved and to have someone to love. Now, yeah, they might screw it up and have wrong ideas about it and how it looks and how we act with it, but they know deep down love is something I need, it's something I want. So, getting to the point Pastor was raising earlier, how can we know morals do exist? So outside of the scriptures, how do we know that they exist, and how do we know that people actually buy into it even if they say they don't? So several ways exist, but probably the most obvious and easy way, or easy to remember, is by our sense of justice and injustice. The difference between the two is only possible with objective morality. Justice is good and moral, while injustice is always wrong and immoral. I believe it is Craig, so this would be William Lane Craig, who uses the illustration of a student receiving a poor grade based on the color of his folder and not the merits of the paper. So what the illustration was is a young student in college writes an essay. They all have to write an essay, a long paper about a topic, and the student chooses to do the topic of that there are no objective moral values and there is no objective right and wrong. Everything is subjective. There's no such thing as justice. So he writes this paper, does a very good job, very well written, very well researched, very well presented, and puts it together in a blue folder and hands it into the professor. The next day he gets it back and there's a big F drawn across it with a note that says, "I don't like blue folders." So the student is outraged, obviously, at this. He put a lot of time, effort, energy, and everything into it. So he goes to the professor and he says, this is unacceptable. You can't give me this grade. And the professor looks up and says, okay, you're going to have to be more specific. I've graded a lot of papers. I don't know which one is yours. And he goes, wait, wasn't yours the one that was all about no objective moral values and no justice and no whatever? And the kid said, yeah, that's the one. And he goes, well, I don't like blue folders. And the kid was mad and upset, and the professor said, look, you know, you can't be mad at me if there is no justice or injustice or moral values. If everything's my own personal subjective opinion, I don't like blue folders, you get an F. And, you know, the student obviously understood, but it didn't make him any happier. So, he, you know, it's not going to change his mind. So, you know, he just had to, you know, accept it. So, often people, back to the notes, we're halfway through that. Often people will deny moral truths until they are affected negatively. It is often the reactions of people that we see that they do possess values, even if misguided or misplaced. Such as rioting after Trump's election for racism, sexism, tyranny, etc. All these things are bad things, and the fact that these people are so passionately opposing them shows they do, in fact, believe these things are wrong. You know, they see something and maybe they misplaced it. But is racism wrong?
Yes.
Is sexism wrong?
And there ain't no such thing as racism.
Yeah, there's no such thing. They blow it out of proportion. Is tyranny wrong? Yes, we know these things that they're saying they're arguing against is wrong, right? We know they're wrong. They're wrong. The Bible tells us they're wrong. So is it, you know, do they demonstrate then in a very real way that they passionately oppose these things?
Yes.
You know, even though they don't believe in God, even though they don't believe in the Bible, even though they may not believe that what's going on has any ties to God, do they show by their demonstration that they do in fact have real moral values deep down? So the moral argument is then undeniable to almost everyone who is being honest. You will be hard-pressed to find anyone who denies that they do not have a feeling that some things are just wrong. Even hardened atheists like Richard Dawkins believe in moral obligations. So before we get to the next sentence, I watched a debate between Dawkins and Craig, and at the end they kind of did like a sit-down Q&A, and they both kind of just responded back and forth to questions from the audience, and it was like an informal thing, not the formal argument anymore, just kind of talking back and forth. And this subject came up, morals and objective stuff, and even Dawkins admitted right there, yeah, there are certain things, Craig said, if there's no moral obligations, this and this and this aren't wrong, but we know they're wrong. And Dawkins like, yeah, that's insane to think they're not wrong. That's unbelievable that anybody would say those aren't wrong. Well, hello? So, back to the top of page 4 notes. A whole section of Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, is devoted to defending children against the child abuse of religious indoctrination. He says that, quote, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. The adage is true as long as you don't really believe the words. But if your whole upbringing and everything you have ever been told by parents, teachers, and priests has led you to believe, really believe, utterly and completely that sinners burn in hell, or some other obnoxious article of doctrine such as women is the property of her husband, it is entirely plausible that words could have a more long-lasting and damaging effect than deeds. I am persuaded that the phrase child abuse is no exaggeration when used to describe what teachers and priests are doing to children whom they encourage to believe in something like the punishment of unshiven moral sins in an eternal hell." So clearly Dawkins believes that teaching children of hell and sin is abuse in a mental way, which he believes is worse than physical molestation. He actually says that in his book. He talks about a friend of his who was molested by a priest and how that didn't have near as much impact on his life as being taught some of these doctrines. But why does this matter to him? Without God, morality is nothing. If naturalism is true, the animal kingdom is full of child abuse and no one cares. Many animals eat or molest their own young or that of the same species. Some kill them to weed out competition. Why are humans expected to act differently than their animal cousins? This is committing speciesism. So you understand what that's saying. If there is no God and there is no morality seated in God, then essentially we are just heightened animals. Nobody's out there arresting lions for eating zebras. Nobody cares. That's what animals do. They don't have morals. Why? Because they're not like us. So people demonstrate they know there's something objectively different between humans and animals. Some people are getting a little crazy on the other side, saying that animals have more rights than we do. But when you look at it, there is nobody out there arresting and putting lions in prison. You don't see that on the news. There's outrage about shooting a lion every once in a while, but nobody's ever gone out and arrested animals and put them on trial for doing what animals do. So C.S. Lewis had somewhat to say to this point in Christian Reflections. Quote, "One thing is immediately clear. We can have no ethical motives for adopting any of these systems. It cannot, while we are in the vacuum, be our duty to emerge from it. An act of duty is an act of obedience to moral law. But by definition, we are standing outside all codes of moral law. A man with no ethical allegiance can have no ethical motive for adopting one. If he had, it would prove that he was not really in a vacuum at all. How then does it come about that men who talk as if they could stand outside all moralities and choose among them as a woman chooses a hat, nevertheless exhort us, and often in passionate tones, to make some one particular choice? They have a ready answer. Most invariably they recommend some code of ethics on the ground that it and it alone will preserve civilization or the human race. What they seldom tell us is whether the preservation of the human race is itself a duty, or whether they expect us to aim at it on some other ground." So what he's saying here is when we have, certain atheists or something say there is no such thing as these moral obligations and duties. We are not obligated to do good. But they, like Dawkins, they get to pick and choose. Well, I like the idea of let's not abuse children because that seems bad to me. So we shouldn't do that. And then like that, passionately, he'll defend children against the abuse of religion and act like he can just pick and choose which ones to tell people, follow this one, well, you don't worry about this one. Follow this one, that one's no good. So how does he get to say which ones choose? And what Lewis says is, what they'll point to is, well, these ones will preserve the human race or preserve civilization or further the species or something to that effect, which we looked at, right, in the last few weeks. What does that then say about the process? It has a goal, right? The goal is furthering the species. So we evolved this morality to further the species. That implies a goal. That's design.
Actually say though.
Correct.
Sociobiological theory of ethics says
right.
that the ethics evolved with the biology.
Right. So I wonder if it's in this week's or next week's. We'll see when we get there. I did put something about it either in this week or one of the next two lessons. But so here Lewis takes aims at arguments like Dawkins. Why can someone who says there is no objective, all-encompassing moral law from God, yet passionately fight the injustice of child abuse? Lewis is right that most of the time, the answer they give is that it will aid society and the longevity of the human race. This assumes there is a goal. Morality exists to aid in survival. So it has a purpose. It can't have purpose in the naturalist worldview, right? There is no purpose. Things just happen. So another way it can be found, I believe, in the psychology of the brain. In Romans chapter 1, we find the description of man's repeated rejection of God and His law and God giving them over to a reprobate mind. It is interesting to me that when some people engage in sinful acts over time, their minds become messed up. We often see a mass murderer or serial rapist and ask what's wrong with their head. These individuals, if captured alive, are subjected to a psychoanalysis and are found to have deep-seated psychological issues. Well, duh. This is due to repeated action that is wrong. Studies in the area of pornography show similar results, as do the studies of homosexual tendencies. There is a definite and undeniable link between repeat offenders and psychological deficiencies. I believe the answer lies in Romans 1. So let's go to Romans chapter 1. We're all familiar, I believe, with this passage. Yes, Muslim. So Romans chapter 1. So starting in 18, we see that for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath shown it unto them. For the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So we talked about this the last 2 weeks, that God's creation reveals Himself. So, according to this verse, did God leave Himself a witness in nature, in His created things? Yes, He left Himself a witness. Were people able to see that, according to this passage? Yes. Did they decide to do the right things with that information? No. So because, verse 21, because that, when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. So go down to verse 24. After resulting in this, what was the result? Verse 24, first one. God gave them up to uncleanliness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. Verse 26, for this cause God gave them up to vile affections. Even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And then verse 28, finally. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not convenient. And we see, a whole list in that passage of what they're doing. And I don't know if people are aware of this, and I have to be careful because it's a hot button issue, but, from way back, things like obviously serial killers and stuff like that, we see they get these psychoanalysis, and we see that they have all these issues, these psychological issues. Well, the same thing starts applying to other areas, and we've just recently, studies have been coming out to show these things, especially in the area of pornography. I forget where the organization, it's not a Christian organization, it's a secular organization that is studying the effects of pornography on the brain. And what it is it actually is worse than any drug, because like a drug, your mind becomes numb to it. Not only is it numb to it, so it needs more and more and more, it also wants different than whatever you viewed. So it becomes this, thing that engrosses the mind so much that it eventually it encapsulates you, and it holds you because it wants more and it wants different all the time, more and different, more and different, more and different. And they're starting to see links between pornography and gateway into homosexuality. What the medical research is, everybody ever heard of like homosexuals saying, well, I was born this way? And they often want to say it's genetic, right? Has there ever been any genetic trace of homosexual versus heterosexual? No, it's not genetic. What they did find, though, is that in the LGBT community, when they psychoanalysis these people, there is a psychological deficiency within them. This was in all the psychology textbooks for years until pressure, they eventually downplayed it. Today, you will find it as an impulse disorder. It's an impulse disorder of the brain. They can't control their impulses anymore, so they just act, and they don't control. So that's what's in the psychology textbooks today. That homosexuality, homosexual tendencies are classified as a psychological impulse disorder. What I would say is right here in Romans, that's where you find that. When people repeatedly do things against this moral law, they repeatedly break this moral law, you see the effects of God giving them up, and giving them over to this reprobate mind. You see that effect that we see in Romans. So what I pull out of that is, you already saw it in Romans, now the psychology is catching up with it and saying, look, yeah, there is a deficiency here. There absolutely is something mentally going on with these people. So the debate is now not, is there or is there not a mental deficiency? The debate is, are they born with that mental deficiency, or does it come with the actions? Do they do certain actions over a period of time and gain that deficiency? That's the debate right now. People don't like that debate, obviously, because nobody likes to think that they're psycho in any way, shape, or form. But we all, to a degree, are, right? We all choose to do wrong. And I think that this, in Romans 1, is showing that. It's telling us that. If you repeatedly choose to sin, it will do something to your mind. It will affect you mentally.
Don't you think that's what Paul's talking about when he mentions people having their conscience seared with a hot iron?
Yeah, I definitely believe that's what's going on in Scripture. I mean,
eventually the witness of that conscience is just sort of snuffed out through the repeated action.
Right, and that's that's the point of like when you get into the problem of evil, it's, I choose to do these things. Just because this moral law exists does not mean I have to follow it. I still choose whether I want to respond correctly or incorrectly to it. And every time, I don't know if I put it in this.
That's an important point what you just said.
Right.
Because people don't realize that the moral law is prescriptive. It describes
Right.
how people should and ought to behave.
Right.
It doesn't describe how they actually do.
Right.
behave.
I don't know if I put it in here, but all right, we'll go back to the notes, and if I don't have it, I'll talk about it in a minute. It's NASA's thing. All right, back to the notes. It's the first square bullet point under the first paragraph there. Design also implies, so this is a quote. This is Tom Woodward. It's a quote from Tom Woodward. It says, quote, "Design also implies constraints. An object that is designed functions within certain constraints. Transgress those constraints and the object functions poorly or breaks. Moreover, we can discover those constraints empirically by seeing what does and doesn't work. This simple insight has tremendous implications not just for science, but also for ethics. If humans are in fact designed, then we can expect psychological constraints to be hot-wired into us. Transgress those constraints, and we, as well as our society, will suffer. So the idea is that we have certain preset functions that God has given us, and when we act outside of our programming, bad things happen naturally to us. I believe this is what Romans 1:27 may mean. So that says, likewise, also the men, leaving the natural use of the women, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. So that when we sin, using our bodies in a way is not designed, we reap natural consequences. And I believe also with that is psychological consequences. When we continually choose to use our minds and our bodies in ways that God did not design them, we will have natural and psychological consequences for that, because we were designed to operate in a certain way. That's what design implies. So, everybody get that section. So I may have actually put this in one of the future lessons, but NASA has a term, and we have to go over this actually for work, because it deals mostly with compliance to rules and stuff like that. But it's, I don't know how to spell, but normalization of deviancy. So normalization of deviancy, and I know I didn't spell deviancy right, but I can't spell. Settle down. All right, normalization of deviancy. This is NASA's term, and what this is actually when I have certain protocols I'm supposed to follow, especially in manufacturing or some kind of a work thing, that they're put in place because they're the safe way to do something, right? There's a safe way to do something that will ensure my safety and the safety of the machine or whatever I'm working with. So, what was it, Challenger that blew up?
Oh, yeah.
Challenger explosion.
Yeah.
This was their prime example of normalization of deviancy. Challenger was not an accident. The lead designer went home that night and told his wife that will blow up tomorrow. It was not an accident. They knew this could happen, but they shortcutted because they were under time constraints to beat the Russians and the president pushing this through and everything else with, you know, this was going to be a huge thing, putting all these people into space that had never been up there before. We were going to be the first ones to send, you know, teachers and just lay people up to space. So because of, you know, all the mass media attention, the president and everything else, they took shortcuts in the designs and everything else to get this to happen now. They knew that this was a very big possibility. So what normalization of deviancy is when we take a shortcut for whatever reason, time constraints, money, pressure, you know, from a boss or something like that to get it done. When we take a shortcut and we take out a step, maybe a safety step or something like that, what happens? Nothing. Nothing happens. Nothing bad happens immediately. We take the shortcut, nothing happens. Well, what that does is it actually rewires our brain to say that what I did was actually safe. And what happens over time is the deviancy becomes the norm. And then eventually that norm leads to catastrophe. And that's exactly what happened with the Challenger explosion. So that's what's going on, I believe, here is this normalization of deviancy. When we do something wrong and nothing bad happens, our brain starts rewiring to say it wasn't really wrong. And I can get away with it again and again and again and again until what I know is wrong becomes my norm. And then eventually that leads to catastrophe. Does that help illustrate it a little more? Yes? Good. All right, so objections to the moral argument. So what would the atheist say to the moral argument? Many argue that morality has a Darwinian origin, such as Robert Hinn, Michael Shermer, Robert Buckham, and Mark Hustler. This is also picked up by Richard Dawkins in his book, The God Delusion, Chapter 6. He agrees, saying, quote, "On the fact of it, the Darwinian idea that evolution is driven by natural selection seems ill-suited to explain such goodness as we possess, or our feelings of morality, decency, empathy, and pity. But what about the wrenching compassion we feel when we see an orphan child weeping, and an old widow in despair from loneliness, or an animal whimpering in pain? What gives us the powerful urge to send an anonymous gift of money or clothes to tsunami victims on the other side of the world whom we shall never meet and who are highly unlikely to return the favor?" So Dawkins admits that morality is a high thing and not an illusion. He argues that they had, He argues that they were just evolved in a process called reciprocal altruism. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. That's what that is, reciprocal altruism. And arose to further the survivability of the species. Just big words that ultimately mean nothing, in my opinion. This is because it does nothing to actually answer the problem. This is the issue again of denying or deifying the process and ascribing foresight and volition to it. So as stated above, one objection is that morality is just herd mentality, which aids in the survivability of the human race by providing order and justice. This morality has apparently only arisen in humans so far, as we have the capacity to choose a more or less desirable action after weighing the consequences. However, this alternate explanation doesn't do justice to our experience. 1, because it assumes purpose. 2, because it is not emotional and chemical. It cannot be ascribed or described or explained by naturalism. 3, many actions make no sense to the survival of individual organisms, such as self-sacrifice to save others. This assumes that herd survival over personal is preferred to the process, which means the process chooses and compares. If survivability and advancement drive all organisms, then why do humans participate in activities that work contrary, such as suicide, murder, smoking, drug abuse, homosexual actions, incest, infanticide? These things are directly harmful or work contrary to advancement. How could the same process that gave us moral guidelines for the purpose of advancement also give us addictions and selfish practices that work completely contrary? Another objection then would be that morals are not universal, but different cultures have different laws. What is gross or immoral in one country is acceptable in another. Men everywhere do evil things. So our response then should be that it may be written on all men's hearts, but it doesn't mean that they are forced to follow it. So Romans 1:21 through 23. Because that they knew God, they glorified him not as God. Neither were they thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made into corruptible beasts and birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. So they knew God, they knew who he was, they knew what he wanted, but they chose to disobey it. So notice that they chose to glorify the creature, man, and his wisdom over God's. God did not force them to make a choice. He allowed them to make up their own minds. This is consistent with our free will. So this is like a couple who are lost, and the wife is constantly telling the husband to ask directions, to which he undoubtedly replies with, "I'm not lost." The problem with people is that in the face of a just and holy God, we would have to admit first we are lost and broken before him. Ultimately, we have a pride issue that keeps us from God. A pride that I'm good enough, smart enough, strong enough, etc. This pride stands in the way of making a decision to trust Christ. Again, it is unusual in the negative. Again, it is usually in the negative that we discover we know moral law exists. As Geisler and Turek state, quote, "The moral law is not always the standard by which we treat others, but it is nearly always the standard by which we expect others to treat us. As soon as someone cries foul, we can see they really do believe in morality, ethics, justice, and fairness. This is shown in all the recent riots against social injustice in all forms. The key word, injustice. They all believe fairness, equality, justice, etc., and are passionate about it. Passionate enough to go on peaceful demonstrations. Whether misled or not, they definitely are convinced that some things are wrong and some are right. So, conclusion. The moral agent is a powerful the moral argument is a powerful attestation to God and His law. By pointing people to the obvious fact that some things are wrong and others are right, and asking them to dwell on this fact, which we often take for granted, we can show them why we feel this way and where this feeling comes from. We can show them how morals cannot arise from any natural process due to them often working contrary to self-preservation and survival of the individual organism. Herd morality is a farce that would require intelligence and foresight to change from individual interest to collective. Geisler and Turek, speaking of this view, as held by Darwinist Edward O. Wilson, say, quote, Wilson says the social morals have evolved because those cooperative morals helped humans survive together. But this assumes an end for survival, for evolution, when Darwinism, by definition, has no end because it is a non-intelligent process. Although it is impossible to prove beyond all doubt that morals do in fact exist, most people know they do. This is because they do exist and God is their source. The Bible claims that we have this moral law conscience and awareness to what is right and wrong. Our job is to show people how to properly respond to this conscience and to stop resisting the Holy Spirit. So we have a couple minutes left. We got like 2 minutes left on the tape. Anybody questions, comments? No? All right, might as well end it before we run out.